Okay. Does anyone have a question to the scenario we have developed so far? So that was actually a very good misunderstanding of which I was guilty of, namely this is here on this level, it is both personal and unpersonal, right?
Yeah, that was the thing that was
yeah, yeah. And it is actually also quite important to realize this, that of course to will the universal, to will as one generally or universally should will, is one way of describing subjectivity. Yeah? But it is of course important that the kind of subjectivity here is different from the kind of subjectivity here. Here it's a subjectivity which is reflected in universality, but that's what I want, that's what I do. Yeah? And here it is. Here I can make a mediation, and on this level I cannot make a mediation. Any question to this scenario so far? Okay. Now, let's turn to the religious. If the religious, or if the, if the ethical, or if this universal moral law, if we interpret in a Kantian way, is indeed the highest principle in virtue of which humans should live their lives. If that is the case, and this is actually what all German idealists, most of the moral philosophers in our time emphasize time and again. Ethics is about universality. Insofar as you just try to realize or pursue your individual goal on this level, you're not an ethical agent. Insofar as you're an ethical agent, you should will in some kind of universal way. No exception allowed. If that is true, and if it is true what all philosophers, more or less, have claimed, then the ethical stage, or the stage of universality, is the highest stage of your existence, and any more authentic stage, that is, some possible religious stage of existence, will be ruled out. Yeah? Now, or however, fear and trembling seems to provide room for the religious and does not pronounce religion as principally embedded in morality. So fear and trembling, or Johannes de Silencio, and Kierkegaard claim that there is yet a more authentic stage, namely the religious, and at the same time, here in Fear and Trembling, Kierkegaard emphasizes that this type of religiosity, this type of authenticity, is not principally embedded in morality. And this is a very astonishing thing for us, because we learned in Purity of Heart that it is precisely the clue of willing one thing, or of this prototype of authenticity, that it is somewhat, it has clearly a moral dimension. Remember, morality is a necessary condition of this willing one thing. I hope you all remember that. Yeah? If you want to will one thing, if this should be possible, then you are required to commit to the good, that is, the morally good. And this morally good, clearly we get access to by means of our common moral sense. Right? The resources for this good rest within us, if you want. So the prototype of authenticity clearly is embedded in morality. How it exactly might differ from morality is, I think, an interesting question, but in every case, purity of heart claims that without this moral dimension, no authenticity, no willing one thing. And here in Fear and Trembling, we learn, we have to swallow, or Kierkegaard claims, that the prototype of authenticity or religiosity is not embedded in morality, as Kierkegaard claimed in Purity of Heart. Because from the viewpoint of morality, the religious, and Abraham clearly is the exemplar of the religious, is the person by virtue of which Kierkegaard illustrates the religious, or more specifically, Abraham's intention to kill his son. This intention, or this kind of attitude, cannot be made to be in agreement with universality. There is no way in which you can describe Abraham's goal to sacrifice or to kill his son being mediatable or being in agreement with the ethical. The very intention to kill his son is not capable of a mediation, is not possibly be in accordance with universality. So what God demands of Abraham is not ethicality. And this is why I said, well, the idea of authenticity in Fear and Trembling now is of such kind that it is not embedded in morality. On the contrary, it is outside of morality. You can also express it in such a way, and Kierkegaard in fact does time and again, from the ethical point of view, which according to mainstream philosophy and nearly every sensible philosopher until Kierkegaard, from the ethical point of view, Abraham is a murderer. The demand to kill his son, which Kierkegaard claims Abraham receives from God, in other words, because it is not capable of being mediated with universality or with ethicality, pronounces once again some kind of subjectivity. Simply because it is not capable of bringing it into agreement with universality, the intention, the attitude to kill your own son expresses, formally speaking, a singularity again, or some kind of subjectivity. And a subjectivity of such kind that it cannot be brought into agreement with the ethical. In other words, both the aesthetic and the religious emphasize, at least from the viewpoint of universality or generality or of the ethical, some subjectivity, some kind of singularity, which is not embedded in this very generality or universality. And now, in this connection, I think the main question of problem 1 of fear and trembling becomes a bit more understandable. Namely, the question, is it then at all possible to give up the ethical ends, that is, ends being reflected in universality, ends which are capable of a mediation? Is it at all possible to give up the ethical ends, or is a teleological suspension of the ethical possible? Is the teleological suspension of the ethical possible? Not a theological. Yeah? A teleological, that is, regarding the end to kill his son. Yeah? Can such an end, which Abraham claims to receive from God, can such a non-ethical end suspend ethical ends? Can it suspend universality? Can we suspend, in other words, this crucial condition of the ethical, namely of being in agreement with universality? Is a teleological suspension of the ethical possible? And with this background, I think we can already give at least some negative characteristics of the religious. The religious attitude, the religious goal cannot be mediated. It is not an instance of universality, or as Kierkegaard says, it is, or it exhibits incommensurability. It is not commensurable with universality. And it thus pronounces, just as, formally speaking, just as the aesthetic, singularity, or some kind of subjectivity that does not reflect the objective order of moral law or of societal values.
Can you say that one more time?
Sorry?
Could you say that last bit one more time?
Yes. Just as the aesthetic, which pronounces singularity due to the fact that we all have different desires, different kinds of preferences, different kinds of interests. Formally speaking, the religious pronounces a singularity. Yeah? Both aesthetic singularity and religious singularity cannot be mediated with universality. I'm not in agreement with universality. You cannot bring into agreement this goal to kill your son or to sacrifice your son with universality. That's impossible. I think that's intuitively obvious. Yeah? So, obviously, in this connection, the religious pronounces some kind of singularity, some kind of subjectivity, just, in some sense, just as the aesthetic. Because both are incommensurable with universality. And of course, the big question, and the question we probably won't be able to answer, but the crucial question turns out to be, well, if that is right, what Kierkegaard claims, that the religious, that there are instances where the religious has a higher degree of authenticity than the ethical. How do we distinguish this type of subjectivity from subjectivity here at the aesthetic stage. Because obviously, I mean, if the religious just represents some singularity which is which we cannot distinguish from the singularity at the aesthetic stage, then this whole possibility of a religious stage being more authentic, being more truthful than the ethical stage collapses. Then all the philosophers, Kant, Hegel, Fichte, Schelling, the main philosophers of Kierkegaard's time, are right. You should, in every case, whatever you do, you should stop here. Right? Your highest type of authenticity is to be attained by virtue of making mediations, to speak with Kierkegaard. Yeah? In terms of our actions and goals being in agreement with some form of universality. And Kierkegaard obviously, or Silencio, obviously claims the contrary. It seems, and not even that is clear. Fear and Trembling can be read in many different ways. But it seems that Kierkegaard uses the Abraham example in order to make us pay attention to the possibility that there is a higher form of authenticity for which it is not crucial that it is embedded in morality, that it is mediatable with universality. So let us, yes please.
Is it to do with sacrifice in the religious stage in general? So it's subjective, but in a religious stage, I don't know if this is the case, but with the Abraham case, it was obviously true that you're actually doing something that's not ethical, but something that you do not want. Something you don't want, something that's not ethical, but something you believe has to be done for a certain good. And in the aesthetic stage, obviously you know it's not ethical, but you gain something from doing it that you want.
Yeah, that's a very good observation, actually. That it seems that Abraham suspends ethicality, even though, and this is what Kierkegaard emphasizes time and again, even though he loves his son. Yeah? He doesn't hate his son. Yeah? He sincerely loves his son, and this love being an expression of universality of the ethical. Yeah? So he doesn't gain anything from it, as you express it. Yeah? He does not, it seems, satisfy his inclinations or desires and interests. Absolutely right. And it's also important because of something which I will pronounce time and again, because Kierkegaard pronounces it time and again. In order to make such, this is sometimes called a leap of faith. A leap of faith. I leap into faith. In order to make such a leap of faith, I lost it. Yes. In order to make such a leap of faith, no, this thought is gone, and the more I try to retrieve it, the more it fades away. I'm sure it comes back in a minute. But obviously this is quite crucial, yeah? Now it's back. Now I know it again. You're right. You're right that here on this stage, if you have made a leap of faith, then in an important way, you don't do what you wish to do. That's your point, isn't it?
Yeah.
You don't fulfill your desires. This is crucial here of the aesthetic stage we have learned. You don't fulfill your desires, but still, I mean, what is the real criterion by virtue of which Abraham can justify his singularity here as opposed to the singularity which he exhibits when he's just an aesthetic agent? Yeah? What is the criterion for that?
Well, it's subjective, so...
It remains to be a subjective, just as the aesthetic. Yeah? So, you could say, well, Abraham gets a call from God. But how should I know that? On what grounds can I decide whether I really get a call from God or whether I became crazy? On what grounds can I distinguish the reality of a real call from God from some neurons firing in my brain and making me become ridiculously crazy and try to kill my son? We won't really solve that riddle. However, what is important in this connection, I think, is that whatever the religious is or will be or turns out to be, one necessary condition of religiosity, and that's something Kierkegaard pronounces time and again, is, in fact, that we have to make it to this very level. Yeah? We have to represent ethicality or universality in order to make this so-called leap of faith. A leap of faith from here to here is not possible, Kierkegaard claims. Yeah? And clearly, Abraham fulfills that very condition because Kierkegaard pronounces time and again that Abraham loves his son. So Abraham is an incarnation of universality before he suspends or may suspend these ethical ends. And such suspension of the ethical, such suspension of universality or generality is in fact what the story of Abraham brings to the fore, according to Kierkegaard. To say it once again, by intending to kill Isaac, Abraham openly rejects universality, that is, the law, the ethical law, not to kill anyone, not to mention, not to kill your own flesh and blood, that is, your child, your son. Well, we might ask, what reasons may Abraham have? Well, as I mentioned, of course, he believes that God tells him to kill his son. The question is, well, is such faith reasonable? Or can it be justified in any way? Obviously, it cannot. It cannot because reason is precisely what Abraham abandons. He abandons it because he does not act or intend to act in virtue of universality or in virtue of a universally binding moral law, in whatever way you might express that. Or he cannot make mediations. He cannot reason from what he intends to do, namely to kill his son, to ethicality, to universality? Obviously not. He cannot make a mediation. So it is impossible to think his goal to be one that exemplifies morality. The religious or the authentic, as Kierkegaard construes it in Fear and Trembling, is not embedded in morality. And since it is not embedded in morality, since Abraham cannot mediate this goal with universality, in this sense, Abraham cannot speak. Or he cannot speak in the sense of he cannot give some kind of rational justification for what he's doing. To give some rational justification for what you're doing here at the ethical stage is pretty obvious. Yeah? You presuppose some kind of expression of universality. Yeah? And if you can make an inference from what you do to this kind of universality, yeah, then you justify it. Yes, please.
As God is omnipresent,
Sorry.
and omnipresent and omniscient, couldn't you just give the reason that it was actually for something that we couldn't comprehend why Isaac was to kill? I mean, why Abraham was to kill his son. It was something that Abraham couldn't possibly comprehend because he doesn't actually understand how the world works. It's actually, it could be, that is actually for good, for something which is actually ethically viable for God. So his justification could just be that he can comprehend why he should do it, but God does.
Well, implicitly you confirm one of the main points, namely that Abraham cannot justify his action. Abraham cannot justify his intention to kill his son. Yeah? And you say, well, maybe this intention is after all, maybe, or is your idea, maybe God pursues some kind of state of ethicality by means of such a, for Abraham, non-ethical action? Is that what you have in mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it is. Who knows? But the crucial point still being, Abraham cannot make a mediation. Right? And on what grounds is Abraham allowed to conceive of it in such a way that this is what God finally tries to realize? In every case, obviously, Abraham cannot justify. And Abraham does not have any insight in God's overall intentions, God's overall goals. God is, this is a deep Jewish insight, God is hidden. Yeah? God is totally hidden for Abraham. God's intentions are not understandable by Abraham. By the way, this accords to what Kierkegaard, and we'll come to understand that more thoroughly, this accords to what Kierkegaard in the concluding unscientific postscript describes as the absolute difference between human beings and God. What a God, possible God, might intend, or his or her goals, how a God conceives of us or of the world or whatever, yeah, is always completely cryptic for us. Yeah. The human being, also in that respect, is exposed to a radical dimension of finitude. God's perspective is an absolute perspective which we as human beings never will intuit. But I think that that's an important point, namely that Kierkegaard emphasizes, well, Abraham doesn't speak, Abraham has to remain silent. Obviously, it is the pseudonym Johannes di Silentio, Johannes of the Silence, who accordingly writes this very book, which does not mean that, well, if you meet Abraham on his way up to Mount Moriah, maybe he could say, well, if you ask Abraham, what are you going to do now? And maybe he would say, or on principle he could say, it doesn't, as a matter of fact, but on principle he could say, well, I'm going to kill my son, I'm going to sacrifice my son now, this is what God demands of me. Yeah? In that sense, he can speak. But he cannot speak in such a way that his speaking involves some kind of act of justification for what he's doing. Yeah? He cannot justify his actions, and he can always justify, you can always justify your actions by virtue of mediation at the ethical stage. And this is precisely what Abraham cannot do. He has to remain silent. And if he said, well, I'm going to kill my son, such talking would be fully deprived of any argumentative force or deprived of any rational basis, which can count as being valuable for us. He leaves behind the rational basis, which is universality in every case. Any question? Well, let's turn to some consequences of that scenario, and the consequences that Kierkegaard himself pronounces. Obviously, first consequence, Abraham's faith is paradoxical. His goal to kill his son stands in contradiction with any reasonable, universal, or general order, independent of whether you have a Kantian or a Hegelian, doesn't matter, order. Yeah? It is in contradiction with universality, in contradiction with reason. In that sense, it is paradoxical for reason. Reason cannot permeate it. Obviously, faith exhibits a singularity, that is, a goal that stands alone without any rational support. Thus, Kierkegaard emphasizes Abraham's isolation. Abraham is isolated. Or, as Kierkegaard writes on page 55, Abraham isolates himself as higher than the universal. He isolates himself from reason, from any reasonable talking, that is, talking in connection with some kind of rational justification. He isolates himself from morality, or from a societal order and its institutions. And all these possible candidates, all these expressions for the ethical, Abraham realizes in himself. It's not that he's not aware of this. It's not that he's not aware of the claim that you should always do what is mediatable, what is in agreement with universality, what is ethical. It's not that he doesn't realize it. He's not an idiot. Yeah? This is precisely what makes it so extremely painful for him to isolate himself, stand apart from human society, from any possible description of reason. So, in other words, and precisely with this kind of background, Abraham's life view is based on utter uncertainty. All these predicates being crucial in Problema 1 of Fear and Trembling. Abraham experiences utter uncertainty. Simply because he has no guiding thread to which he on which he can rely on, as he would have if he remained to be an ethical agent, an agent who realizes universality. Abraham is obviously in fear and trembling. And Abraham is full of anxiety. And this lets us see an important point of faith or of authenticity, more generally speaking. And this is something in its abstraction returns again and again in Kierkegaard's work from slightly different angles. Authenticity never is anything that can be ordinarily demonstrated. It cannot be proven. It is never certain or rationally defendable. On the contrary, it seems that the more insecurity there is, the more faith there is. In the concluding unscientific postscript, to which we return to in a couple of weeks, Kierkegaard illustrates it in such a way that he says, well, 20,000, that's a relatively known quote, perhaps you came across that already, 20,000 fathoms below the sea, having all evidence against me, all rationality against me, and I still believe that is faith, that is authenticity. Independent of what kind of stand we take towards it, and of course we have to discuss it, which we'll do next time more thoroughly. What you can in every case see now is what I announced in the very beginning of the course, namely that the movement from one stage to the next, especially the movement now from universality towards religiosity, this movement corresponds obviously to some kind of devaluation of standards of rationality. Insofar Abraham intends to kill his son, he has given up on any standards of rationality. The ethical is the embodiment, is an incarnation of rationality. It doesn't allow any exceptions. It doesn't allow to pronounce your subjectivity in any way being characteristic of aesthetic subjectivity, but it doesn't allow subjectivity in any other way either. Rationality, at least some ordinary account of rationality, seems to be devaluated, seems to be abandoned here. We have 5 minutes left, and I'm not finished we will continue the next time. In the first half, we will continue with this presentation. In the second half, we will discuss the film in connection to Fear and Trembling. But the last 2-3 minutes, perhaps, I want to give you some possibility to ask a question. But be sure, if you feel overwhelmed now, you will have plenty of opportunity to ask questions the next time. And it might also be a good idea to reread the first Probleme of Fear and Trembling again for next time. Any immediate concern, any immediate question? Yes, please.
Before I've learned about this as the tragic hero and the knight of faith. Do you agree with that? Like, is this what we're talking about?
This is precisely one point which we will discuss the next time.
Okay.
Yeah? The crucial idea is, well, the tragic hero suspends one expression of the ethical in favor of another expression of the ethical. The scenario is a little bit more complicated. It turns out that there are different expressions of ethicality. Yeah? I call it here universality 1 and universality 2. Yeah? A tragic hero might, from an objective perspective, just do what Abraham does, namely to kill his daughter. Yeah? But he does do so for the sake of universality. Yeah? That is, he abandons one more primitive expression of universality in favor of a more authentic expression of universality, but the crucial point being a tragic hero being still under the spell of universality. Yeah? The tragic hero can make a rational justification for what he or she is doing. And at another instance, Kierkegaard says, well, you can weep with a tragic hero, you can understand him, you can feel with him. You cannot do that in the case of Abraham. Abraham leaves universality behind. And that will turn out, I will refer to it more explicitly next time, but this is basically the crucial difference between a tragic hero and a knight of faith. A tragic hero still is under the spell of universality, does act by virtue of universality, by virtue of a higher expression of universality though, but still by virtue of universality, and this is precisely what Abraham does not do. Abraham acts by virtue of absurdity, Kierkegaard says, by virtue of paradoxality. So he cannot give a rational justification. A tragic hero can. You'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions next time. Thanks a lot for your attendance and your benevolence here. And now we turn to the nicer part of today and watch the film, which has some really interesting parallels to Fear and Trembling, namely breaking.